Good evening everyone, welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 7th July 2025 and in this class we'll be discussing the Hindu newspaper in a detailed manner. Today we have some important topics. So one by one we'll try to discuss all these topics in an exam relevant manner so that this discussion will be helpful for your exams. So before going into this discussion, please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. So the first topic with which we are going to start this session is about recently Trump announced another round of 25% tariffs on Indian goods exported to US. So therefore the total tariffs reached to 50%. So therefore it will have some serious implications on India's trade with United States. So let's understand why Trump announced additional tariffs on India. What is the main reason for that and how it is going to impact Indian exports to US. And in fact, India has one of highest tariffs. For example, if I say it correctly, US has imposed highest tariffs on India than any other country, even higher than China also. So let's understand this topic. So President Trump recently imposed additional tariffs of 25% on Indian exports to US. And we all knew that on July 31st, US has imposed 25% tariffs on Indian goods. So therefore, the recent announcement by Trump to impose additional 25% of tariffs are over and above the already existing 25% tariffs that were announced by US President Donald Trump on July 31st. However, the first 25% of tariffs takes effect immediately, but the next 25% additional tariff will come into effect 21 days after. However, what is the main reason which has been cited by US President Donald Trump when he imposed 25% of additional tariffs on Indian goods? So he says that India's oil imports from Russia. So we all knew that Russia-Ukraine war has been taking place, and Donald Trump has been doing everything to mediate between Ukraine and Russia, and he wanted to stop the war as well. However, Russia is going for a war, an all-out war with Ukraine, and it becomes very difficult for US President Donald Trump to do meaningfully something which can actually stop the war. So therefore, the reason that Trump has cited, India has been importing oil from Russia, and India has been indirectly financing Russia's aggression against Ukraine in this Russia-Ukraine war. So therefore, he claims that India's oil imports from Russia are undermining US sanctions against Russia. Right? So this was the reason that he has been cited for sanctions or tariffs on Indian goods. However, Trump repeatedly threatened India of tariffs as a penalty if India continues to import oil from Russia. However, India's stance is very clear. So India is fully committed for its energy security. India is also committed to protect its national interests. So therefore, it is a threat from US on India. However, traditionally India followed a policy called strategic autonomy. Now, what is strategic autonomy? So it is an independent policy that India has adopted over the last few decades. So therefore, India always maintains this independent stance. And in fact, the overall objective of the strategic autonomy is to protect India's core national interests. So I hope you have understood this. Now, what is India's stand and what is India's response to the 25% of tariffs initially plus additional 25% tariffs on Indian exports to US, right? So total 50% tariffs on Indian exports to US. Now, how these tariffs impact India's exports to US? Now, Indian goods can no longer be competitive in US market compared to other countries. For example, India exporting, if I can say that India has been exporting textiles. India has been exporting textiles, and China also exporting textiles to US markets. Now, compared to Indian goods, so Chinese goods are cheaper. Chinese goods are cheaper in US markets compared to Indian goods. Now, why Indian goods are not cheaper? Because of the tariffs which are imposed on Indian goods. So tariffs make Indian goods more costly. Tariffs make Indian goods more costly compared to Chinese goods. And this is the reason that the consumers in US would prefer Chinese goods over Indian goods. So if consumers don't prefer Indian goods, Indian overall exports to US will substantially reduce or decline, right? So India's exports to US will decline. So if India's exports to US decline, then the production in the textile factories will decline, and it would result in layoff of employees, right? So or job losses. So therefore ultimately it will hit certain sectors of the economy. So those sectors are substantially dependent on its exports to US. So one such sector is the textile sector. So I hope you have understood how these tariffs are going to affect India's exports to US. Now let's understand what is the response of the government of India to these tariffs on Indian goods. The Ministry of External Affairs called the decision from US President Donald Trump as unfair, unjustified, and it is unreasonable as well. And in fact, so India further reiterated its stance that India is committed for the energy security of its 1.4 billion people. And also remember that India is the world's largest populous country. So therefore, energy imports are based on market needs and the national energy security for 1.4 billion Indian people. And in fact, India also highlighted the hypocrisy of US because European Union, Turkey, China, all these countries are importing LNG and oil also from Russia. But President Trump specifically imposed tariffs on India. So therefore, India also highlighted US, European Union. So they continue trading with Russia. So even US also importing fertilizer, uranium from Russia. So, so despite that, so Trump focused on India. So Trump imposed tariffs on Indian goods. Now, during his first term, Donald Trump and Prime Minister Narendra Modi have taken India-US relations to a next level. But this term of US President Donald Trump, so both countries are going through a different path, right? So therefore, the relations between US and India are being strained under US President Donald Trump as in his second term, right? So I hope you have understood this. Now, in fact, India also committed to protect its national interests diplomatically and economically also. For India, energy security is very important. So one thing that we should highlight is energy security. So along with energy security, the strategic autonomy. So strategic autonomy is also another very important aspect which is very important for India, right? So energy security, strategic autonomy. Now one thing is that if India stopped importing oil from Russia, So if India stopped importing oil from Russia, so India would send a wrong message to the world that through such penalties, India's policy choices can be changed, right? For example, coercion as a method would work. So this is what the other countries develop a stance towards India, right? So therefore, in this context, India should be firm when it comes to its energy security, and India should adopt strategic autonomy as its policy, right? So let's understand the impact of the tariffs on trade and strategic implications. So 55% of India's exports to US, they will be impacted, right? So around 55% of what India has been exporting to US are going to be affected. Mostly textiles are going to be affected by these tariffs. And in fact, the tariffs will also create around 30 to 35% of cost disadvantage for the Indian exports to US. However, both India and US have been discussing the bilateral trade agreement, and this bilateral trade agreement can also be jeopardized because of the US imposing unilateral tariffs on Indian goods. And in fact, experts have been advising both particularly US to restrain, avoid retaliation, and continue negotiations in national interest. Now, what exactly is a retaliation? So since US has imposed 50% of tariffs on Indian goods, so India may retaliate imposing tariffs on US goods. However, experts have been advising to maintain restraint and don't impose tariffs on US goods. So don't do the retaliation, right? So therefore, India should continue negotiations in the national interest, right? So I hope you have understood this topic. And the next important topic is, so recently the sports governance bill has been tabled in the parliament, and the sports governance bill talks about the reforms that are brought in this sports governance. However, BCCI, which is a private organization, the key question is whether BCCI should be part of the Right to Information Act or not. But the sports governance bill clearly says that BCCI is out of the ambit of the right to information. So let's understand some details about the sports governance bill and why BCCI is out of the purview of Right to Information Act. Now, the Union government amended National Sports Governance Bill, exempting BCCI from the Right to Information Act unless it receives government financial aid, so thereby triggering concerns over transparency and accountability in Indian sports administration, right? So if BCCI is out of the ambit of RTI Act, then it triggers certain concerns regarding the transparency and accountability, particularly how BCCI is working. Now let's understand the key amendments in the Sports Governance Bill 2025. Now, in fact, BCCI will not be fully subjected to the RTI Act of 2005 unless it receives central and state government assistance. Any sports body which has been receiving central and state government assistance, then that particular body will come under the purview of RTI Act. But as of now, BCCI is not part of the RTI Act. And in fact, the amended clause also restricts the right to information applicability only to the queries regarding public funds, not on the internal functioning. However, previous clause 15 subclause 2, which mandated RTI coverage for all recognized national sports federation, was omitted. And in fact, if this clause continued, then BCCI would also be part of the purview of the Right to Information Act. And in fact, now only the government funded sports bodies are deemed to be public authorities under RTI Act, and all public authorities would come under the ambit of the Right to Information Act. And in fact, the Right to Information Act empowers the citizens with the information, and it also brings in the transparency and accountability in the administration of the sports, and also the functioning of the sports governance bodies at the national level and the state level. However, despite such an exemption from the ambit of RTI Act, BCCI must adhere to the provisions like forming an athletes committee, ethics commission, and even safe sports policy as well. So let's understand the difference between the National Sports Code 2011 and Sports Governance Bill of 2025. The government already framed Sports Code 2011. So let's understand the basic difference. The legal status in terms of the Sports Code 2011, they are just executive guidelines. But this National Sports Governance Bill, if it becomes an act, it is a statutory legislation. And if we talk about the enforceability, the Sports Code 2011 is non-binding and it is just an advisory in nature. However, the Sports Governance Bill 2025, it is legally enforceable via tribunals because it is a statutory legislation. And if we talk about the representation, there is no mandatory gender and athlete quota when it comes to athlete committees, ethics commission, and safe space policy. However, the Sports Governance Bill 2025 mandated that there should be mandatorily 4 women and 2 elite athletes as well. And in fact, when it comes to the BCCI regulation, the Sports Code 2011, it operates outside its purview. However, the Sports Governance Bill 2025 talks about it brought under the BCCI has been brought under the National Sports Framework Governance Net. And in fact, the dispute resolution, there is no dedicated mechanism under the Sports Code of 2011, but Sports Governance Bill National Sports Tribunal has been established for the resolution of disputes. And there is also a provisions for elections monitoring as well. And in fact, the election monitoring will be handled by the Ministry of Sports as per the Sports Code of 2011. But Sports Governance Bill 2025 mandated that there will be an independent national sports election panel. Right, I hope you have understood the basic difference between Sports Code 2011, which is executive guidelines, and Sport Governance Bill of 2025, which is a statutory legislation. So let's understand the legal and institutional debate between the BCCI and RTI, whether BCCI should be brought under the ambit of the Right to Information Act or it should be exempt from the ambit of RTI Act. We all knew that the RTI Act has been passed in the year 2005, and in fact it gives a statutory right for every citizen to seek information. Therefore, it empowers the citizens through information, and it also ensures the transparency and accountability in the administration. So therefore, RTI Act of 2005 defines a public authority as a body which is substantially financed or created by a law of parliament or a state legislature. Only then it will be considered as a public authority. But in this case, BCCI is not substantially financed or funded by the government. So therefore, BCCI is not under the ambit of the Right to Information Act. Because as per the RTI Act of 2005, only those authorities are classified as a public authority which are substantially financed by the government or they are created by the law of parliament or state legislature. However, the Lodha Committee in the year 2016 and Law Commission in its 275th report in the year 2018, so they have also recommended that BCCI should be brought under the RTI Act. So remember that Lodha Committee is very important when it comes to the sports reforms and sports governance. So therefore you have to remember this. So therefore, Lodha Committee has already recommended that BCCI should be brought under the purview of the RTI Act. because its monopoly, because of its public role and indirect government support that it has been getting, such as land grants and other tax benefits. However, BCCI has been strongly objecting to this particular body bringing under RTI Act. BCCI itself don't like that this body should be brought under the RTI Act. But on the other hand, the Lodha Committee, Law Commission, they have already recommended that the BCCI also getting the indirect government support in terms of tax benefits, land grants, so therefore it should also be part of the RTI Act. And if we talk about the BCCI, it is registered under the Tamil Nadu Societies Registration Act of 1975. And this amendment ensures that the bill does not conflict with the existing legal provisions of the RTI Act and avoids any legal challenges also. So however, let's understand what are the bodies to which the RTI Act of 2005 applies. So those are the bodies which are created by the laws of the Parliament and state legislature. So they would be classified or categorized as the public authorities, and they would be brought under the RTI Act. And other type of bodies which are owned, controlled or substantially financed by the government, they will also be brought under the RTI Act. And in fact, with this bill, only the financially assisted activities of sports bodies can be questioned under the RTI Act, and in fact the substantially financed, it remains a key legal criterion to identify any body which is a public authority or not, which falls under the RTI Act or not. So I hope you have understood the debate between BCCI whether it should be brought under the RTI Act or not. Now let's understand the National Sports Governance Bill and some of its key highlights. Now, what is the purpose why the government brought the National Sports Governance Bill? Because it aims to ensure transparency, accountability and good governance in India's National Sports Federation. And through the National Sports Governance Bill, it proposes formation of National Sports Ethics Board and Dispute Resolution Tribunal as well for the resolution of disputes. And in fact, the National Sports Governance Bill also recognizes the rights of athletes, and in fact they are being recognized as the stakeholders, thereby ensuring adequate representation in the decision-making bodies. And National Sports Governance Bill also enforces the term limits and age caps for the office bearers in sports bodies. So if we talk about the RTI coverage of the sports bodies under the National Sports Governance Bill, any sports body which is categorized as a public authority, then those bodies would be part of the RTI Act. They come under the RTI Act. And it brings sports federations under the RTI Act for greater transparency as well as accountability. And in fact, the National Sports Governance Bill also have certain provisions for the gender equality as well, because it mandates at least 25% of the representation for women in all sports bodies. And in fact, it also provided for the penalty for misgovernance and also ethical violations as well. So therefore, this is a comprehensive legislation for sports governance in India, which aims at ensuring transparency and accountability in their respective functioning, and along with that, it also ensures gender equality as well. So therefore, I hope you have understood this topic as well. So let's understand another very important topic, which is about RBI's policy stance in recent Monetary Policy Committee meeting. So let's understand the context, but before understanding the context, so this article has been given in the Indian Express newspaper, and this will be important for the Gender Studies Paper 3 Economy section. And in fact, we all knew that Monetary Policy Committee takes important decisions regarding the policies, right? So particularly, it takes decisions on repo rate, reverse repo rate, keeping in mind inflation as well as the policy or economic stability or price stability. So recently, the Monetary Policy Committee decided to keep the policy rate unchanged, so thereby maintaining a neutral stance. And in fact, the RBI's Monetary Policy Committee maintains either contractionary stance or expansionary stance or the neutral stance as well. But this Monetary Policy Committee meeting has followed the neutral stance. That means there will be no increase in the rates, or there will be no rate cuts, that the policy stance will be neutral or same. So therefore, it has been reflecting confidence in the Indian economy despite the global uncertainties. So we all knew that there are global uncertainties. So for example, Russia-Ukraine war and Israel-Gaza conflict and Iran-US conflict, and US President Donald Trump has been indiscriminately imposing tariffs on all other countries. So all these factors have been leading to the global uncertainties. But the Monetary Policy Committee has maintained a neutral stance when it comes to the policy rate. So therefore, it actually reflects the confidence on Indian economy despite the world is going through the uncertainty phase. So let's understand the policy decision and inflation outlook from the Monetary Policy Committee. The Reserve Bank of India left the policy rate unchanged. That means a neutral stance has been adopted, and which is in line with the expectations. So therefore, indicating that there is a price stability or economic stability despite a global turbulence or global uncertainty. So this actually represents the confidence on the Indian economy. However, the consumer price inflation is expected to stay around 2% in June 2025, and it would remain between 4 to 5% through financial year 26, thereby easing food prices, especially the vegetable prices. And in fact, the vegetable inflation was also high in recent months, but with improved supply. For example, what is inflation, right? So let's understand what is inflation. I hope all of you aware about inflation. So inflation is general rise in the level of prices is called as inflation. Now when inflation happens, so inflation happens because of the scarcity of the goods, right? So scarcity of the goods, right? So in case of goods are not available, in case goods are not available, for example vegetables, if vegetables are not available, the prices of the vegetables would increase, and people cannot afford vegetables, people cannot afford food, right? So however, in recent months what has been happening, that there is an improved supply, improved vegetable, so that would bring inflation under control, right? So it results in moderate inflation. However, still then RBI remains cautious due to the potential food price volatility. Now food price volatility is very high in India, and because of that reason RBI always remains cautious, right? So let's understand the difference between the consumer price index and wholesale price index inflation. In fact, when we talk about the wholesale price index, so it actually tracks inflation at the producer level, right? So it tracks inflation at the producer level. However, when we talk about the consumer price inflation index inflation, it tracks inflation at the consumer level. It tracks inflation at the consumer level. It tracks inflation at the producer level. And in fact, the wholesale price index, it does not capture changes in the prices of services, which CPI does, right? So in fact, understand one thing, that wholesale price index will not capture the prices of services. It will not capture the prices of services, but consumer price index inflation capture the prices of the services. Now in fact, the wholesale price index and the consumer price index, who releases them? The wholesale price index released by Office of Economic Advisor, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. However, the consumer price index inflation is released by Central Statistical Office, which is under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. However, wholesale price index calculate goods only, but consumer price index calculates both goods and services as well. And wholesale price index cover 697 items, and consumer price index covers 448 for the rural basket and 460 for the urban basket. So if we talk about the wholesale price index base year 2011-12 and consumer price index base year 2012. So this is the basic difference between the wholesale price index and consumer price index. So let's understand the growth projections and the domestic factors before discussing the neutral stance from the RBI's Monetary Policy Committee. So in fact, the Reserve Bank of India retained its GDP growth forecast of 6.5%. So in the financial year 26, India would grow 6.5%, right? And in fact, the 6.5% GDP growth of India would be further supported by strong agricultural activity because of good monsoon this year and resilient rural demand and favorable monsoon conditions as well. So therefore, India would grow at 6.5% per annum this year, and still India be the fastest growing major economy in the world. Secondly, stable interest rates, which are reflected through the RBI's monetary policy stance. Along with that, the lower inflation in the economy and rising consumer demand. So these factors would contribute to the economic resilience despite the global turbulence. And in fact, the private consumption would also play a very important role in the Indian economy to make it more and more resilient. However, India's growth continues to be driven by the domestic demand with limited dependence on exports. So we would not depend on exports excessively. So that is why US tariffs on Indian exports would not affect Indian economy badly, right? Because we mostly depend on our domestic demand, as merchandise exports to US form only 2% of India's GDP. So let's understand the global pressures and the policy implications as well. So recent tariff hikes by US on Indian goods are unlikely to impact India, but they add uncertainty to the global trade and warrant close monitoring as well. So we all knew that US has imposed 25% tariffs on Indian goods on July 31st, and yesterday US President Donald Trump announced additional 25% of the tariffs on Indian goods. However, they will not significantly impact India, but they add to global uncertainty. However, despite economic optimism expressed by the RBI's Monetary Policy Committee through its policy stance, the private investment remains cautious due to the lingering global risks or the geopolitical turbulence, even as corporate balance sheets showing signs of strength as well in recent times. And apart from that, India's foreign exchange reserves stands at around 650 billion US dollars. So therefore they remain strong and they cover nearly 11 months of imports, and it has been indicating resilience against the external shocks as well, such as US imposing tariffs on Indian goods. So I hope you have understood this as well. So let's discuss another very important topic, which is the flash floods in Uttarkashi or Uttarakhand. Now you all knew that yesterday also we have discussed about this. A cloud burst triggered flash floods in Uttarakhand, devastating the infrastructure. A number of people were missing. Now what is the context? So let's understand the context of this topic. The context is that the massive floods triggered by the torrential rain in Uttarkashi Kheer Ganga river led to fatalities and destruction. So therefore, it has been highlighting increasing frequency of extreme weather events in the Himalayas. And in recent times, because of the deforestation is responsible for such a large scale destruction in the Himalayan region. So Himalayas are ecologically fragile zone. So deforestation and shifting cultivation shifting cultivation, unscientific agricultural practices, and human settlements and developmental projects, particularly the hydroelectricity projects, developmental projects, urbanization, unplanned urbanization, and the commercial activities in the fragile Himalayan area. So all these factors, coupled with the climate change and global warming, led to the increasing intensity and frequency of such events such as cloudburst, flash floods, and even the torrential rains. Now, what is a cloudburst? So yesterday we have discussed. So cloudburst is heavy rainfall which is concentrated in a particular area for 1 hour or less than 1 hour is considered as a cloudburst, and cloudburst very often trigger the flash floods as well. So these flash floods are responsible for such a devastation that took place in Uttarakhand, right? Now let's understand what exactly is a cloudburst. In fact, yesterday also we have discussed about these cloudbursts. Now cloudburst is a localized or extremely intense or heavy rainfall event, right? So at least 10 centimeters of extreme or heavy rainfall within 1 hour over an area of approximately 10 kilometer into 10 kilometer. And in fact, even 5 centimeters of intense and heavy rainfall over 30 minutes can also be considered or classified as a cloudburst. Right, so I hope you have understood the definition of cloudburst. And in fact, these cloudbursts are very common in the mountainous areas. So why they are very common in mountainous areas? Because the mountainous areas experience orographic rainfall. So this orographic rainfall would trigger the cloudburst followed by the flash floods. And in fact, the climate change, global warming, so all these factors have been triggering heavy rainfall over these mountainous areas, particularly Himalayas and the Western Ghats as well. Now when warm air reaches these mountainous areas, so it starts ascending, right? So it starts ascending over the mountain slope and it further expands due to low atmospheric pressure at the higher altitudes. As it expands and cools, the air releases its moisture in the form of precipitation, and that triggers heavy rainfall. And in fact, the large volumes of warm moist air keep rising, accumulating moisture without releasing it. It can lead to a sudden and violent downpour of rainfall. Right? So in fact, the Uttarkashi region witnessed a torrential rainfall or a heavy rainfall over a localized area between August 3rd and 5th, with some areas receiving nearly 30 centimeters in a single day. So therefore, it has been leading to a sudden surge in the water and the debris. Though it has been termed as a cloudburst by the state officials, the Indian Meteorological Department's definition, 10 centimeters of rainfall per hour over 10 into 10 square kilometers of an area, right? So it may not have been met due to lack of radar verification. And in fact, the flood waters immediately engulfed the buildings in Dharali town, which is 8,600 feet altitude, thereby resulting in at least 4 confirmed deaths and 60 feared missing and possible casualties among Indian Army personnel as well. Now let's understand the strategic vulnerabilities and misdiagnosis of such weather phenomena. Now, quick labeling of such incidents as cloudburst would allow the governments to deflect the accountability and portraying them as a uncontrolled natural phenomenon, right? So they just shift the blame or the responsibility to the uncontrolled natural phenomena. So therefore we cannot do anything. So therefore we should not label them as a cloudburst. Rather, we should understand what exactly triggered such a weather phenomenon, right? Or such a large scale disaster. So if we can carefully understand this, we could actually prevent such a large scale weather related disasters as well. Right, so a preparedness is very important. Inadequate preparedness to the flash floods or the cloudburst is also responsible for such a large scale devastation that took place in Uttarakhand. However, the absence of high altitude Doppler radars that would further limit IMD's ability to detect real-time precipitation data, thereby hampering disaster prediction and early warning systems in the mountain terrains as well. So therefore, what needs to be done? So we all knew that the frequency of extreme rainfall or the intensity of such events has been increasing. It is primarily attributed to the climate change and the global warming. So in fact, it has both man-made and natural causes as well. So thereby, the climate change coupled with other factors such as commercial activities, human settlements, irresponsible urbanization, deforestation, shifting cultivation. So all these factors are affecting the ecologically fragile regions like Himalayas. And large-scale infrastructure development along with the developmental projects are also responsible, because the large-scale infrastructure development projects very often lack the environmental assessment or the environmental impact assessment. And that has added to the slope instability and intensified the disaster impacts through the debris accumulation over a period of time. However, after this disaster, the state authorities must urgently review the silt and debris buildup and identify the risk-prone zones through a comprehensive evaluation and assessment of these zones, and implement the buffer mechanisms to mitigate the future climate-induced disasters in this area. So therefore, such large-scale disasters or the devastation can be prevented or minimized. So that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much.